Hello and welcome. There are about 6.7 billion people on this planet, and the population is growing by about 152 people per minute. With so many competing for the same precious resources such as food, water and energy, is population growth, rather than war, really our greatest threat to our survival? Some experts argue that a shortage of food and water could create panic and trigger conflicts. It's not unlike the plot of the classic cult film Soylent Green, where an overpopulated Earth in 2022 is forced to survive on processed food rations because traditional agriculture has disappeared. The movie was meant to scare the public about the consequences of overpopulation and pollution. So as our numbers grow, will these doomsday scenarios be realized? Or is it merely science fiction? Well, today we ask, how real is the population time bomb and what can be done about it? Joining our debate from New York is Dr. John Bongartz, the Vice President of the Population Council, which seeks to improve policies dealing with poverty, disease and reproductive health. He supports voluntary family planning programs as one way to alleviate poverty. From Seattle, economist Bjorn Lomborg joins us. He believes that the threat of overpopulation is nothing more than a scare tactic. He's the author of Cool It, the Skeptical Environmentalist's Guide to Global Warming. And from Berkeley, California, we're joined by Dr. Martha Madison Campbell, the president of Venture Strategies, a non-profit organization that works with local market forces to improve the health of low-income people around the world. She argues that the population growth in the developing world may derail progress in the UN's Millennium Development Goals. I welcome you all to the show. Bjorn Lomborg, I should start by saying I know you're not a fan of scare tactics and the fear factor when it comes to environmental issues, and I guess in this case even the population growth issue. What's your view on this?
It is a problem in the very basic sense of saying more people, that means more problems, in the sense that they're going to be spending more resources, they're going to need more food. But what we also have to remember is that partly we have seen some of the greatest increases in human welfare. Why we've seen dramatic increases in human numbers? Why? Because we've actually had even more innovation. We've been even smarter. We've been able to outcompete the increasing demands for individuals. And so it doesn't seem likely that the scare tactics of we're going to see ever more people and that's going to derail all the progress seems likely. And also, of course, we have to ask ourselves, what can we actually do about it? Well, not very much. We have seen the major increase in population. It's actually declining. It's been declining since the early 1960s in amount of percentage. So what we're seeing now is the tail end of an incredible explosion in human numbers, but it's not the primary concern either in terms of what will actually create problems, nor in what we can actually do anything about.
But beyond, there is the issue of where the population is growing and where it's shrinking. The divisions between the developing world and the developed and industrialized nations, surely.
Clearly, and we are seeing the opposite problem that in the developed world, we're actually seeing declining numbers, or at least in most of the world, not in the US. But we're certainly seeing declining numbers exactly because we have now gotten so rich that kids have gone from being a way to ensure your life, your way of life, to actually being a cost. And so you go from having perhaps 5 kids per woman to less than 2 kids, which is the replacement ratio. So we got to realize in the long run, we're likely to see the same thing happening in the developing countries. And so we got to ask ourselves, what can we reasonably think we can do about it? And unless we're willing to be an authoritarian China, we really can do very little about it. But also, we got to remember, it's simply not the main problem. The problem really is to make sure that we have sufficient research and development, for instance, in agriculture, which we haven't had over the last 20 or 30 years, to maintain productivity growth, and of course having, for instance, free trade, so that all the countries in the developing world will be able to trade their products and grow rich.
Well, let's get a perspective from Dr. Martha Madison Campbell, who's joining us as well. And Dr. Campbell, do you feel the world is overpopulated right now?
I feel that if we were, that it is overpopulated. In fact, if people come up to the levels of consumption of the United States and Europe, which in fact we have no right to say they can't do. And in fact today, this is nothing about scare tactics at all. This is really about the scientists with their feet firmly on the ground. Just in the Financial Times, London Financial Times today, there's an important article talking about with the soil erosion and population growth, in Africa, the population is going to double in Africa between now and just 2050 and not stop there, that Africa essentially can't feed itself. But there is something we can do about it too. There is something that we can do about it within a human rights framework, and that is something that many economists do not understand, and that is letting people, enabling people to have the number of family size children that they want, which is very difficult to do. I can explain more later.
Right. Well, Dr. Campbell, I have to ask you, though, you know, we were showing a map there as you talked of how the population is predicted to grow in the coming decades, and it shows India, Pakistan, China growing very quickly. Now, one of the key things is you were saying it's about consumption. So presumably it's not just an issue of numbers, it's an issue of what those numbers are doing to this planet.
That's right. As a matter of fact, population is just one factor. It happens to be a critical factor, however. There are other factors that are very important in terms of what happens to this planet. But if you don't pay attention to the population growth in the countries that are the least able to handle that growth, then you've got a very severe problem in terms of environment, in terms of health, in terms of education. Health systems and education systems cannot keep up with the rapid population growth in the countries that are the poorest.
Now, Bjorn Lomborg, listening to what Dr. Campbell has to say there, and considering some of the resource issues on this planet, of course, water is one that's you know, often overlooked, and it's going to be something that will become of greater concern. How do you address some of the concerns that Dr. Campbell has raised?
Well, Martha is obviously right in saying we need to make sure that people are allowed to make their own smart decisions. And definitely we should focus more on education, for instance, of women, which we know will also limit the population growth. We should definitely also focus on making people rich, because that's one of the ways that we know many people will choose to have fewer kids. But we also have to realize that it's not the primary way either to regulate the world into the future, simply because we can't do very much about it. Even if we distribute condoms, availability of reproductive rights, we know that it doesn't change very much how many kids a woman chooses to have, because very often it's a very rational decision on if you're living in a country where you have no social security, where your kids are your social security, you will choose to have many. What we need to make sure is that we get a richer and a better educated society so that those choices will become different. When we talk about the resources, absolutely the fact that there are going to be more people will mean more resource use, all other things equal. But of course, what we tend to forget is that as you go richer, you definitely reduce your resource consumption in many smart ways. For instance, with water, you can do much more with much less if you're rich. So the main point here again is to remember, where is it we can actually do something about it? And that's not predominantly on population, it's on all these other issues that we touched on.
Okay, Dr. Campbell, we had an email from a viewer by the name of Halle Berry Nuhu, and our viewer wrote in saying, how does family planning reduce overpopulation? Countries which have one-child policies still suffer. The real challenge is to the so-called developed countries. They should put their resources into agriculture instead of funding irrelevant wars. Now, of course, I mean, apart from the sort of comment on the political aspect of conflict, let's take it through your perspective on how you see the next steps in terms of some kind of population control through the family planning route.
I think we should look at the Islamic Republic of Iran, which has done a stupendously fabulous job of bringing its birth rate down from 5.5 children on average in 1985 to 2 children by year 2000 without any one-child policy, without any coercion. This was astonishing. It was right after the Iran-Iraq War, when the economists recognized that their population was growing faster than their economy, and this meant they were heading toward poverty. Mexico, by the way, noticed the same thing in 1970. And what they did in Iran was the Ayatollah Khomeini actually approved getting all forms, all methods of family planning and making them available, including free sterilization for men and women, condoms, IUDs, pills. And the one thing that they do in Iran that I've never seen anyplace else, is that all couples planning to marry are required to be instructed in contraception. And we can't find that anyplace else. Today, there are more women than men in the universities, and that could not have happened had the birth rate stayed high. And you can't make countries rich while their birth rates are high. We have not seen any country get out of poverty while its birth rates are still high. It's impossible to do. It's the other way around. You need to be able to let people have family planning as they did in Iran, and then it is possible to actually avoid poverty.
Well, now, Bjorn Lomborg, you were saying that you felt that the other aspects of other aspects need to be considered before population itself. When it comes to the current geopolitics and the fight for resources, the fight to develop, and countries like China and racing to build their levels of industrialization and population success, how can you start to regulate those other factors when you've got basically geopolitical concerns?
Well, basically, of course, the problem is, as Jan also, Bongartz also pointed out, was that you can focus your policy very much on population control. But does that actually do very much good? I mean, I think it's very instructive that the example is Iran, and I don't mean to be polemical here, but is that really the best thing that Iran could have been focusing on? Don't we want to focus on all the other things, namely opening up trade, development? Absolutely, but that's, of course, very much a first world perspective. Absolutely allow people to have control over their reproductive abilities, but also allow better education, make sure that we prevent more diseases, those kinds of things. And yes, we've seen most of the developed world got rich while it was reducing its population, and you can have a long discussion of whether one followed the other, but it's very clear that you can easily do something about increase in wealth, whereas it's very, very hard to regulate people's population behavior.
Now, of course, when you have one or two countries dictating a lot of what happens in the world, you have the reigning superpower, the USA, having big say in what happens. Can you actually engage other countries to make these decisions if they feel there's some degree of hypocrisy coming from the country that has the highest level of consumption?
Well, clearly that's very, very hard to go out and say you can't consume, and that's also, I think, what Mary very clearly pointed out. No, we're going to see most of the developing countries do the exact same thing. They're also going to be consuming a lot of resources. Now, the question is, will we be able to do that on the planet? And a lot of people will tell you, no, we can't sustain that kind of behavior. But what we have to realize is many of the developed countries, also some of the cleanest countries, we're actually the ones, because we're rich, that can afford to deal with many of the problems, even though we have many people. Certainly there are many, many people in Holland, but most people wouldn't say it's overpopulated. It's a nice country. Most people would probably like to live there, exactly because when you're rich, you deal with many of your problems. You mentioned water scarcity before. Yes, but let's just remember that only about 1% to 2% of water consumption goes to people. Most goes to industry, and the vast majority goes to agriculture. Both of those will be dramatically intensified and made more efficient if you have development, if you get richer.
Right, we're going to ask you to stand by because there's more of our debate on the population explosion after this short break. Stay with us.